Now I want to introduce our next very, very distinguished speaker, who is David Graeber, who many of you will have read him if you haven't met him before. He's an American anthropologist, hi there, political activist and author. Currently he's at the LSE, and he was, before that he was an associate professor of anthropology at Yale, and he's played a role in the global justice movement and was one of the earliest organizers of Occupy Wall Street. And I love being occupying here at St. Paul's because of that. He's the author of numerous books, The Democracy Project and Debt, The First 5,000 Years, and read a lot of his articles in the lib.com on Rojava. David, I'm sorry we're very late to introduce you, but here you are, and we're all ready to hear every word you say. Thank you.
All right. How long would you like me to talk for?
Well, let's say 20 minutes.
Okay.
Because he's so interesting. Don't you think we should give him 20 minutes?
I could do that, yeah. All right.
You had more. I can't give you less. I mean, I can't give you less. We want.
All right. Well,
we'll see how we go.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor. I wanted to talk a little bit about my own personal experience. In early December, first couple weeks of December, I took a 10-day trip with, I guess it was called an academic delegation of roughly 8 to 10 people. Our numbers kind of fluctuated, which flew into Erbil and then entered Rojava, and we spent about a total of 8 of those days going everywhere in Jazeera Canton. You know, we went to 5 or 6 different cities. We went from everywhere from farms to sewing factories to popular assemblies, TV studios, anything you can possibly imagine, academies. There's this place called the Academy of Mesopotamia, which is sort of like a university. They don't want to call it that, which is being created. With Sarakanya, and like sort of observed the site of one of the major battles with Al-Nusra. Everywhere we went, we talked to people and did extensive interviews, and then sort of sat around and discussed it all night. At one point, for example, when we were trying to figure out how the popular assembly system worked, we spent an entire evening. You know, we didn't have access to large pieces of butcher paper, so we were like, sort of trying to figure out how all the different groups nested. We kept sort of pasting together pieces of paper, which got larger and larger and larger and larger as we tried to work out the complexities of how the system works. And even then, we only got about half of it. So we feel that we have some idea what's going on there. It's a very fluctuating situation. It's changing all the time, but it's an incredibly exciting experiment. And I thought I would just say a little bit about what's happening and putting it in a larger context of revolutionary politics over the last 20, 30 years. Just give an example of the ambition of the aims. Well, there's one thing that really struck us all along is the contrast between the incredibly straitened circumstances that people were operating on and the sort of ambition of their vision, this incredible optimism amongst incredibly difficult sort of circumstances. So, on the one hand, this Jazeera is under almost total embargo. It used to be under complete embargo, like the border to the North Turkey. There was a little while that they would let people out but not back in because they're trying to depopulate the area, but basically nothing comes back across the border. You can't get medical supplies, you can't get anything. It's caused a terrible medical crisis. Again, the KRG was actually building a ditch along the border so that nobody could even sneak humanitarian aid or of any kind over there. That after the PKK basically saved their capital, there had to be some kind of recognition. So now there's one kind of pontoon bridge which is open 4 hours a day, where you can bring things back and forth. And this is also where we cross. We took a ferry there. That's the one place where anything comes in and out. And of course, the other part of the border is with ISIS. So as you might imagine, not a lot of stuff moving back and forth there, other than bullets. So there's incredibly strange circumstances, but at the same time, like this remarkable optimism and sense of vision. And one of the real senses that we got, first and foremost, everybody, is this almost incredulity that the rest of the world wasn't paying attention to what they were doing. There's this sense of like, but we're having a social revolution. This is amazing. Why doesn't anybody care? And so, for example, one of the first places we visited was a police academy, I guess you could call it. It's not a very good translation. Asaish means security, and so they're the equivalent of the police. But they have academies are not academies in the sense that we think of them. In fact, academies are a key part of the revolutionary process, because one of their major themes is deprofessionalization of knowledge. The Syrian regime was based not only on terror, but on the sort of cult of expertise. And one thing they've been trying to do to counteract that is to do the exact opposite. They take as much information as possible and put it in as many hands as possible. Because, as was pointed out, to a large extent they've had it easy in terms of the ruling class basically leaving. The Syrian regime took off. Almost all the large landholders and a lot of things had been collective, then were either de facto or formally privatized, and then regime cronies. All of those guys took off. And they cleared out everything. I mean, we were in the offices that they used to use. They took out the desks, they took out the wall fittings, they practically took out the light bulbs. So when the Syrian regime left, they took everything they could, but they left the buildings and structures. So all of that stuff that had been in their hands has now been collectivized. Anyway, so the academies were set up largely in these abandoned buildings that had once belonged to the government or their close associates. And the idea is to use them to create sort of 6-week usually courses which can get as many people through them as possible of different sorts. They have economic ones where they teach how to manage a cooperative. They have feminist women's academies. They have a whole range of different sort of political ones. So this one was a security one. So it's sort of like a police academy, but it's also in a way exactly the opposite of that, because they explained to us. When we came in there, and it looks sort of militaristic. There are all these people in these uniforms, and there's always a custom when you come to a place. They have to shake. Everybody has to shake everybody's hand. So we had like 100 guys there, and women, like in a row, standing like this in uniforms, and each one of us went to shake each one of their hands, and they were all chanting in unison. And we thought, oh, this is a little militaristic. But then the people running it sort of explained to us, well, our basic plan, our ultimate vision, is to give everybody in the country 6 weeks of police training and then abolish the police. This was interesting because I'd actually been part of this thing called the People's Parliament, where we were discussing getting rid of the police, and of course everybody's, well, what do you do if somebody just shows up and randomly attacks people with a knife in a crowd, or so of course, what would you do if you don't have police? And we kind of stumbled around and came up with various ideas, but yeah, that would do it. There you go. Just make sure everyone has police training and make them accountable to local assemblies. And it turns out that, in fact, this is very important because the means of coercion, is what makes a state a state. Classic definition of a state is monopoly over, the legitimate use of coercive force, violence within a given territory. And of course, the Asaish guys, the first thing they said is we see ourselves as protecting not a state but society. So we are ultimately accountable not to the government, but to the local assemblies. And I think this is really key to what's happening here, because at first I was a little disturbed when I was reading up on Rojava, because there are these statements that sort of serve as a constitution. They aren't called a constitution, but a set of agreements. And they don't even talk about the popular assemblies. They make it sound awfully like a fairly liberal government. There's a parliament, there's ministers and ministries and so forth and so on, sort of self-administration system, as they call it. But the more we were there, the more we began to realize what's really going on. Okay, you have this sort of thing that looks like a government, although they insist it's not a state because it doesn't have the reins of force and power. And then you have Djam, the sort of means Movement for a Democratic Society, which is the bottom-up organization which creates the popular assemblies and sort of nested hierarchy of they send delegates to people who send delegates to higher groups, and it's all based on principles of direct democracy. But essentially what you have is almost unique in world history. It's a dual power situation where it's essentially the same guys created both sides. So they created the government and the popular groups that are opposed to them. They set them up in such a way that the popular groups are the ones that ultimately have access to the means of force. And this really also came home when we actually went to one of these assemblies and watched the debate. And you could tell this was a real democratic debate, because people were very angry and yelling at each other at several points. So this wasn't fake. Ultimately, one of the things that made them most angry is at one point someone had called in the SOAS, the security people, and asked them to arrest someone. I think they were hoarding sugar. So as these are price controls on basic necessities and sugar, so, all social transactions are mediated by tea. Sugar is a very essential item. So they'd asked for the SOAS to intervene. In this case, this guy who was a merchant who was thought to be hoarding sugar, and the SOAS guys said, well, no, we have to clear this with our superiors. And they were like, what? No, you don't. You're answerable to us. We're the Democratic Assembly here, So they became very upset by this, and we're trying to figure out what to do to make sure that this never happened again. So there's a very, very clear sense that, we must keep the means of enforcement in the hands of the genuinely democratic groups. The way that these democratic groups work, and certainly in terms of justice, and this is very interesting, they have, every, I think, 200 homes roughly, is equivalent to one local assembly. And those assemblies, they have a presidency, there's always one man, one woman for everything. Oh, this is actually also very important, because anything you do have to have someone directing, there's always two. It has to be one male and one female. And this is not just on gender principles, they said, but there's a even more basic than that. There is a principle that no one should ever make an important decision by themselves. So even if you have to get the agreement of one other person, it's still critical. So, you have the male, female, and then you have the facilitator guy, and this assembly that we saw. And this is fairly typical, but they have working groups, and there's always going to be an education working group, a security working group, that's what most of them are, health one, and so forth and so on, the political one. And those confederate, so both the assembly itself and the working groups send delegates, always one male and female, to a larger district one, and they send delegates to a municipal one. They're delegates, they're not representatives, they can't make decisions in theory, they're just been making decisions made by the popular assemblies. Popular assemblies themselves work, and they actually have a very interesting system in terms of process, because one of the big questions I always have is, well, how do you balance voting versus consensus? And a lot of this is inspired by the ideas of Murray Bookchin, who hates consensus. So I kind of expected it to all be by vote, but actually it's not. The way they do it is they use majority voting for anything sort of technical or where there's no moral or political sort of baggage, right? But anything which actually they feel to be genuinely important, then they have to use consensus process. So in the meeting we were at, For example, they were discussing allocation of hours of electricity. We only got enough for 8 hours a day. How many of them should we move to the night? How many of them should we do during the day? Because it's winter, it gets dark early. So that you can show of hands. But if it came to something which actually has political implications, then they go into consensus process. But I bring this up because the one working group which is relevant to security concerns are the best translation I saw was they're called the Peace and Consensus Committees. And the Peace and Consensus Committees are actually do low-level local justice, including what we would consider criminal trials, by consensus process, including the person accused. So they get the families and everybody to do a restorative justice. And both the SOAS guys and the people involved in this said, we have the most basic principle of justice is to eliminate the idea of revenge. It's restorative justice. How do you undo the damage? Again, I can go into much greater detail. I will try to confine myself to the broadest outlines, but I think this is very interesting because, and often they can do that. They can actually get the person who's accused of something to themselves agree as part of the consensus process to what restitution would consist of. Sometimes it doesn't work, and then you have to bounce it up to a higher level. The reason I think this is important is because it shows something about revolutionary process that in some ways, you have it easier in a traditional society, right? Or a somewhat traditional society where, if you're living under the Syrian government and you have a problem between neighbors, you don't go to the cops, right? I mean, basically, no matter what's going on, you don't really go to the state unless you really have to. So people already have a method of resolving. However, it's obviously got some problems. It's highly patriarchal. There's a sort of logic of the feud. So what essentially they're doing is they're taking the advantages of having a very ancient tradition, and they are simply, reshaping it into a revolutionary instrument. It reminds me very much of the Zapatistas, who have traditionally done things by consensus, except it was very patriarchal. Male elders dominating. So they set up caucuses for women and young people to sort of balance and ways of balancing that out, but keeping the advantages of the traditional system. Very much like this. So, for example, not only do they have this complex competitive system, and they have a quorum where it has to be at least 40% women present at every meeting, but in addition to that, they also have all women's assembly on every level. Each assembly, each working group is balanced by an all-women group, which can veto any decision they make, which they think might have negative effects on women. And this does happen. It's not just on paper. We heard examples where there were the Peace and Consensus Committee came to an agreement about some local crime, but if it involved violence against women, the Women's Committee would come in there and say, no, that's way not harsh enough. You got to change that verdict. So this is just to give us a sense of what's going on. I could talk about it for hours, but I think what I want to emphasize is the dual power nature and why this is happening. And it's a really interesting reflection on the state of revolutionary politics in general. We have this situation where people realize essentially that taking over the mechanism of the nation state is not going to solve anything. We've done that over and over again. It hasn't worked. So all over the world, when you see democratic movements, and I think if 2011 is remembered for anything, it's going to be remembered as the sort of, if it's like a sort of world revolution in the sort of sense that Wallerstein says, like 68 was, or 1848. It's the point where everybody realized that, to be a democratic movement no longer means to try to take over the state apparatus and democratize it. We know that doesn't work. It means creating a state outside of that structure, because essentially the core state, the judicial apparatus, the institutions of coercion are not answerable to the political authorities or anything we could call the people at all anymore, anywhere. They're answerable to a global planetary bureaucratic system which operates in the interest of capital. Coming out of the global justice movement, that's what we were really talking about. That's what the IMF is. That's what the World Bank, but also things like the EU or NAFTA local version, but also the bank, like Goldman Sachs and the S&P are equally part of this, and transnational corporations. There's this kind of planetary administrative system. Some parts are supposedly public, some parts are private, some are in between, and some, what is the legal status of the IMF anyway? It's technically part of the UN. But nobody's really sure. But those people ultimately, and NGOs, and even a lot of the NGOs that seem like the nicest ones, are also part of that structure. They're what, Bourdieu would call the left hand of the state. And we saw this because, one of those international human rights groups, I can't remember which one, wrote a report, was rather critical of Rojava, and one of their comments was, well, they don't give people proper trials according to international standards. It's like, well, yeah, because international standards assume a top-down monopoly of course of force state. And human rights assumes the existence of a state and then tries to moderate it. But if you don't have a state at all, apparently that's a human rights violation too. This tells you something. It also tells you something that, human rights like one of the there's one place where the Syrian government still has control in Al Jazeera Canton. It's like a little flag block area, including the post office, but it was symbolic somehow. But the major thing they control is the airport. And think about that for a moment. It makes perfect sense, right? Because, what are you going to do with an airport if you're not a state? If you have two airports, you can fly back and forth between them, right? But they've only got one. So, you got, in order to send a plane to another country, you have to be recognized within this giant planetary administrative bureaucratic system as a real government that can, up to security standards, commercial agreements, safety agreements. You have to be a state. So, essentially, it creates this terrible situation where to do anything in the international community, you have to maintain that very monopoly of course of force, which is the thing they're trying to avoid. So I think it's an incredibly creative solution to create, something that looks and operates exactly like a state, except it isn't one, because it doesn't actually control the mechanisms of coercion. So I think I'm supposedly out of time, right?
You've got 1 minute.
I have 1 minute. Oh, okay. I was going to say that. Yeah. So I think that's something that is really interesting innovation, but it creates a tension, right? Because the problem is once you have these mechanisms in place, how do you ensure that international pressure and the desperate situation you have is you're under embargo. As I say, there's this constant contradiction between the grandiose visions, which are to a large degree being realized, and the incredibly difficult circumstances. We talked to doctors. We talked to this one guy saying, well, it was very funny because he looked like this really kind of straight guy with short hair, smoking a cigarette, leather jacket. Looked like he's some Syrian military guy or something. He might once have been. But then he starts talking and saying, well, we feel that a lot of disease is caused by stress or preventative. It's like the world is so stressful. I can't even go to the city. I get all stressed out. If you surround some trees, and we ended up calling this guy the hippie doctor. And so, we feel that heart disease, diabetes, cancer, it's so stress related. If we just leave the city 70% green space, it'll all go down. Anyway, so you have these provisions, and then we talk to the other guy saying, yeah, we can't get any sort of replacement parts of the machines, like the dialysis patients, we're all dead. So this is the kind of contradiction that you're dealing with. Okay, so
Thank
just
you
to finish.
very
Yeah,
God, of course we would like to listen to you for another 2 days or a week.
No, I have a conclusion with this. So within this straitened circumstance, I think that no, you confused me. I had a brilliant conclusion that I was going to cover this. But that's basically the situation that people are in. But so the danger is once you start getting aid, once people aren't putting into this terrible embargo, how to prevent that thing which is set up to do the function of a state without being a state from actually being a state, because that's the pressure that they're going to do. That was my
I'm sorry.
Yes.
I shouldn't ask a question as a chair, but just want to know, because I was there a year ago and you've been there recently, how and you're wonderful the way you describe the huge ambition and then the actual circumstances, but how are they dealing without any humanitarian aid going in, with no help from UNHCR, with the over 1.5 million IDPs who are still coming in? It's the only relatively safe place. How are they dealing with that as they get no help? How are they actually dealing with things through this big gender equality thing? How are they dealing with violence against women? Also violence and domestic violence with them, and also from the women who are coming in who are actually victims of the sexual violence from ISIS and from the regime. And how are they dealing? Because you saw and you met the YPG and YPJ when they've never been equipped by anybody with the proper arms, and yet they can still fight against the ISIS with their own Kalashnikovs.
Oh, well, I mean...
Well, just,
okay.
can you, I should be asking a question.
Sure, I mean, that's, I could talk an hour about that. But, I mean, needless to say, no embargo is complete, and there's insane amounts of smuggling going on.
Yeah.
You know, and as a result, that's had effects on the economic organization. So they say there's 3 layers of economy. They have this sort of open market economy, the sort of traditional bazaar stuff, which is where they regulate prices but otherwise necessities, but otherwise leave it alone. Then you have the cooperative level, which they're trying to develop, and then they have the war economy, which is like 70 to 80% of it because they're at war. But you know, there are people who are traditionally all about getting stuff over borders. I mean, that's what you do in an area like this.
So, can we have questions? Yeah. No speeches, but really comments or questions, but in brief. Yes, and say who you are.
Stefan, I've heard there's a lot less participation.
Can you speak a bit louder?
A lot lower participation in the popular assemblies by the Arab population, especially among women.
No, that's it. Well, the one I was at, there were a lot of Arab people, but like obviously it was just one. I think that the women is a big issue. I talked to people about this a lot. I mean, we all did, because it was an obvious question. And there's a distinction, first of all, between sort of parts of the Arab population that have always been around and parts of the Arab population that are kind of part of the Arab Belt. There was this attempt to essentially ethnic cleanse and bring in people in the 60s and 50s, 60s, 70s. And a lot of people in those communities kind of are terrified they're going to be ethnic cleansed back again, and they really don't want to cooperate. And then there's the gender thing. And we talked to some of the Syrian Christians, and they were just like, yeah, this is the greatest thing ever. They were really happy. They have their own militia. But they said, yeah, one of the big problems is that the women's union doesn't actually have an Arab branch because we haven't managed to get that off the ground yet. So the Arab women who want to take part in this stuff actually end up going to the Syrian Christians groups. And indeed, this is the biggest, I think, strategic problem, is on the one hand, they have this model and they really would like it to be a model for Syria in general. They say this could be the solution to our problem here, creating these popular assemblies. When they move in, drive ISIS out of some territory, the first thing they do is they try to create a local popular assemblies and democratic institutions. But how do you, on the other hand, you want to make alliances of existing rebels and so forth, but a lot of those are just on incredibly patriarchal lines. So where do you draw the line? In the sense of, the person who's actually, I think, president of Kurdistan in the formal self-governance structure is an Arab tribal patriarch. I mean, literally a patriarch. He's the patriarchal head of a patrilineal group, and it was a great. You want to have people like that on your side. He's also a capitalist. But how do you balance that? Is a really big strategic question, because they don't want to compromise on the basic principles of women's rights. It's the fundament of the revolution. That's the most basic principle. On the other hand, you're living in an environment where you have to make alliances.
Thank you. Can we have 2 more questions and then answer this one?
Very
Yes,
quickly,
say who you are.
2 questions. One for David. How would you basically expect, or what expectation we should have from the global to support these grassroots autonomous revolutionary in Rojava to survive and develop? Personally, I don't expect much from the lefties because they need a state to take the proletariat to the power, but what we can do to survive. And another question for her, the relationship between the women's revolution in Rojava and in Turkey as a whole, as a geography. Because I'm from the east, and we did the same in a more primitive, without these 30 years experience back in 1979, but we were crushed down by the Islamism of the Iranian regime, which basically people, they don't want to know about what happened at that time. We experienced ISIS in a Shia version before. So anyway, my question is, what is the relationship between women's movement in Turkey as a whole with this Rojava, with this women's revolution in there? Obviously, because they must have some kind of connection together. It cannot be just
Between Rojava and north of Kurdistan.
no. The North Kurdistan, okay, with the Turks.
Oh, I see.
women.
Okay.
Inside the
Belongs
Turkish
to-
geography.
Okay.
Okay. Well, yes? You? Yes?
Yeah, I'm better. I wanted to ask Havin, now that we're seeing the YPG and YPJ fighting, advancing towards Raqqa, and there were declarations they're going to fight ISIS all over Syria, and they're also involved with the regime. How do you see other groups in Syria, whether armed groups or political groups, that are ready to support and adopt the principles of democratic confederalism?
Thank you. And just one more before we get the quick answers. Any more? Yes, you.
I was very interested this is kind of to both speakers because it touched on things you both said, but it was very interesting that you said, David, that this is now like a blueprint for spreading democracy, but it's sort of like it's happening in Catalonia with the CIC, it's happening in like South America with loads of active groups, but I think like we're talking about, by the time it gets global, will we not have like a methodology for just dissolving states? You no longer need to fight and uprise. You just democratize and localize.
Yeah.
That's
Little
the
eggshell,
Yeah,
hollow
yeah,
it
yeah,
out,
yeah,
and then eventually it'll crumble. Yeah.
Okay, so you can
What
answer.
were your views on that? Like,
Thank you. So,
Oh, you want me to take, exactly so. I mean, I think that what we're seeing is the gradual evolution of a new revolutionary formula, because you're no longer dealing, and you probably never were, but now it's very clear, you're not dealing with like a series of individual nation states, each of which has a capitalist economy and so on. You're dealing with a global administrative system which has enormous power, and which even a lot of the guys who look like the good guys are actually invested in that global administrative system. So you have to essentially pursue a double strategy. And the way Bolivia was the first model of that, where a political party which was based in local direct democratic, the Galalco, takes power. And they actually said, the vice president actually wrote this out, this is a dual power situation. We are not going to demobilize our base. We want to have guys with Molotov cocktails who can overthrow us if we sell out. Because you're under so much pressure to sell out that, the only way that we got any negotiating status at all in relation to global capital and the thousands of enforcement mechanisms is to be able to say, well, I do what you say, but we'd be out of there in an instant. There'd be an uprising. You have to institutionalize the ability to rebel.
I like that. And also, we're protecting you from the crazy ones.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We protect you from the crazy ones. That's
So
awesome.
would you like to, in general, there were a few questions. Yeah, I think the Kurdish women's movement and its relationship with Turkish women's movements or any other movement. It is a difficult and complex relationship throughout the colonization process, because what had happened in Turkey and in other parts of Kurdistan and the colonizers is that there was a great deal of walls being built between the Kurdish people, their struggle, and the left of these other countries. Because I tried to get into that a little bit in yesterday's seminar. The PKK never fit the norm of anybody. So therefore, there were a lot of critique from all fronts. You know, like the Kemalists would think that they are going to, you know, destroy Turkey, and the right would think they are Marxist-Leninist, Orthodox Marxist-Leninist. And then the left would say, no, no, they are nationalist. The Sunni would say they are Alevi. Alevi would say, no, Ocalan is Sunni, or that he's Armenian. You know, so you had all these complex issues. Whoever fitted whatever, you know, to create prejudice was used. And this includes the women's question as well, because both including Europe and also in Turkey, it's like, why is everyone talking about women? Okay, why not? You know, why not? And so there's been a lot of prejudice on that as well. This mainly concerns perhaps the feminist movements in Europe. But in Turkey, it's more to do with the prejudice that has been created. So, but this is over the years is being overcome now, and I was not able to speak about the developments in North Kurdistan, but there are, as David talked about Rojava, there are also complex layers of mechanisms being built. For example, you have the HDP, which is People's Democracy Party, which is for the whole of Turkey. And in it, you know, it's like a huge popular assembly kind of a thing, but it's a popular political, you know, official political party with a People's Democracy Congress on the side of it. And this is not a party or an official thing, but like a huge popular assembly kind of a thing for the whole of Turkey, where different left groups, women's movements, different ethnicities, beliefs, and all that can represent themselves in there. And then with this, you have this official party that goes into the elections. But it doesn't end there, because you want to be able to, as I talked in my speech, try to talk about it, you want to, you know, like dissipate the centers of power. So what happened is that they separated the local assemblies from these political parties. So now all the municipalities are going into election under DBP, which is Democratic Regions Party. So you have another layer of mechanism, and then another layer of mechanism is the city assembly, and they have grassroots assemblies or committees or communes or whatever, and then they all come and form this city assembly. So you have several different, and of course the women's movement, I mean, I talked about it a bit yesterday. It is organized completely separately, and David also pointed it out. This is also the case in the north as well. So you have these several different mechanisms where you can reach out to different sorts of people and try to include them in discussing, deciding, and, you know, and it's not dogmatic in that sense. I mean, that's why it can get confusing a little bit. The principles are there, and what is being done is to try and involve as many as possible. So in that sense, the women's movements, Kurdish women's movements, contact and solidarity and support, or acting together even, is developing out further, and but it's still not at the point that is desired, because it's taking a huge lot of time to destroy that image, the prejudice that was given both to the PKK and to the Kurdish people, because, you know, they are looked down upon, you know, because they are ignorant, they are backward, and this is the way they are viewed. So that's on the one side. Who is supporting them? Well, this is also developing slowly due to the complex relationship we've been talking about, you know, because of this prejudices created amongst peoples against one another. And it is as if, you know, if Kurdish people awaken, you know, it's as if like they will take the land of yours, or their lives will be destroyed, you know, because what has been done is that the state has made the Turks, the Arabs in general, I'm talking, and that's the elites of theirs, not the whole of the people, but a partner in crime, you know, like with the Armenian genocide. You know, after the genocide, you give the land and the businesses and the homes to the ordinary Turks, or the elite that you're trying to create. The same with the Syrian massacre, the same with the Kurds, you know. So therefore, you're creating such a relationship with the other population that it will jeopardize, in inverted commas, you know, the goods that they are owning or whatever. So, but this sport is growing, you know, because people have seen the amount of violence and injustice and exploitation it is producing, not only on the Kurds, but as a result, Turks are not free either. You know, they can't be free because there's always this obstacle, because if you try and always suppress the Kurds, then you can't generalize the freedoms anyway. So there's this always pulling each other back. So the biggest supporters, as much as the movement can outreach them, are becoming those who are excluded by the system already. You know, who've been done wrong, like the women, like Assyrians, like other beliefs, you know. And as these walls are brought down, this is becoming more. And within the Free Syrian Army, the Volkan al-Farad has been really working closely in defending some of the lines with the Kurdish people. So there are such groups propping up even more. And just finally, and all the contradictions that David has been talking about, and I think I tried to mention them as well in terms of we are the product of this 5,000-year-old patriarchy, you know, and so there is a revolution every day. This is how it should be handled. Otherwise, it will seep through. You know, if you let go, if you don't struggle with one another, with yourself, within the society, within this, you know, pulling down those mechanisms that recreate the exploitative system, then the old will automatically be in charge again. You know, you don't really need the US to come and do this. You know, I think we shouldn't overemphasize that so much. Otherwise, we'll lose the focus. Yeah.
All the time, in every possible opportunity we have, we're involved with preventing sexual violence in conflict. They've done scoping missions in Iraq. They refuse to go into Rojava, where the women's organizations have got huge experience and doing extraordinary work, but need a lot of support and help to deal with all these women who have fled from ISIS, fled from the Assad regime, and who've been victims of sexual violence. And also, I have to say, my letter to The Guardian, of course, didn't go in. I don't think they'll ever publish me again. But the House of Commons Defence Committee asked for written statements on the situation in Iraq and Syria and response to the Daesh, to ISIS. And they call it Iraq and Syria. And there is not one single mention of how the people were taken and rescued from Sinjar. There is no mention whatsoever of Rojava. There's no mention of the YPJ and the YPG. And when it says Kurdish fighters in one section, it's all about Barzani's Peshmerga. So we have to do a lot in this country, in every way you can, through your MPs, through all the groups and meetings that you go to actually make our government get out of the, probably I'm being racist again, get off the knees of the US, sit up and be its own master, and be independent and actually recognize Rojava for what it is, because it is an extraordinary, wonderfully ambitious idea that we really want everyone to know about. Thank you very much.